Welcome to the Crypto Guild. I am your host Rahul, and on this channel we discuss everything crypto. Today's video is going to be about comparing and contrasting two of the more popular consensus mechanisms out there, proof of work with proof of stake. As we go through this comparison, we're going to actually see whether one is actually better than the other. So let's get right into it. Now, before we start, we need to take a couple of steps back and first understand sort of the key players and the key components in a public blockchain project like Bitcoin and Ethereum. So number one, you have the users, and the users are the folks who initiate transactions, right? Who exchange Bitcoin or Ethereum amongst themselves. Second, you have a temporary transaction pool. This is where all transactions that are done are temporarily stored, right? Third, you have a group of users or a set of users called validators, and they have two roles. One, to write transactions into the blockchain, and their second role is to verify transactions in the blockchain, right? And then finally, we have the blockchain itself. The blockchain can be thought of as a distributed database, and it is sort of the system of record. Whatever is in the blockchain is considered to be the truth for that entire project, right? Now, last thing I'll say here is that blockchains, validators, and the temporary transaction pool are all sort of key components in what we call consensus, right? So let's go ahead and understand what consensus is now that we know the key players and components in a public crypto project. So consensus is the mechanism by which a blockchain is secured. So what does that really mean, right? So that means the mechanism by which transactions are written into the blockchain, the mechanism by which transactions are verified in the blockchain, and then finally the rewards and punishment structure to make sure the entire system is kept honest, right? And this essentially gives rise to three core questions when understanding consensus. Number one, what do you need to do to qualify as a miner or a validator? Now, this terminology miner is used more with proof of work blockchains, and the terminology of validator is used more with proof of stake blockchains. Second key question is, how does the network select who will be the one to write into the blockchain and who will be the one to verify what's been written? And finally, what are the incentives and disincentives in place to keep the network in integrity? Now, proof of work and proof of stake are two of the more common consensus mechanisms, but there are many, many more out there, right? That's point number one. Point number two is that you should think of these more as resources that help in consensus. You can even have projects where both of these are used in conjunction. Yes, absolutely. And finally, no two implementations of proof of work and proof of stake are actually the same. So the proof of work implementation of Bitcoin is different from proof of work implementation of Litecoin, and similarly, Cardano's proof of stake is different from Ethereum's proof of stake. Now that we understand the key players, the key components, and essentially what consensus is, let's look at specifically proof of work, right? And try and understand it in the context of these three key questions we just came up with. Now, in general, in proof of work, miners compete with each other to solve cryptographic puzzles to earn the right to create a block and include transactions in that block, okay? And so they get rewarded for doing this work. Now let's understand this equation in terms of the three questions we just came up with. So point number one, what do you need to do to qualify to be a proof of work miner? You essentially just need specialized computing hardware. This is also known as hash rate or hash power, and essentially it has to be good at solving certain cryptographic puzzles. Second, how does the network select who will write into the blockchain and who will verify what has been written, right? So your chances are proportionate to how much hashing power you hold, or if you say it another way, how capable your computer hardware actually is. All the miners need to then compete to solve a cryptographic puzzle, and these puzzles are of like varying difficulty levels, right? And eventually, when one does solve the puzzle, a block is created and transactions are added to it. The miner who then created the block broadcasts that information to all the other miners, who now obviously have to stop competing because someone's already solved the puzzle, and then they switch to a role of verifying the information that has been written in the block to ensure that it is accurate, right? And thirdly, what are the incentives and disincentives in place to keep the network in integrity? Well, for one, miners who create the block get a block reward, and this typically diminishes over time. If you use Bitcoin as an example, the block reward when the Bitcoin blockchain was started was 50 Bitcoin per block that was created. And every 4 years, what happens in Bitcoin, it becomes half. So currently we are at only 6.25 Bitcoins per block, right? And this is going to keep going further and further down over time. And in Bitcoin's case, it's every 4 years. Miners also get to keep, in addition to the block reward, they also get to keep the transaction fees associated with all the transactions that were included in that particular block, right? And creating blocks with fake transactions or spurious transactions will likely get rejected by verifiers, as you have to essentially modify all preceding and subsequent blocks. This takes a lot of computing effort. It's not easy to do, and something called the longest chain rule is typically followed. Now, we won't get too much into this, but essentially know that validators, when they're verifying the system, will always pick the set of blocks that have the most effort associated with them in creating those blocks, right? And to break the integrity of the network, you need access to 51%, or at least, I wouldn't say at least, but I would say you need it, somewhere between 33 and 51% to actually go ahead and do this. Next, let's talk about proof of stake consensus. Again, in the context of our three questions. So in general, in proof of stake, you have to stake your coins, meaning you have to commit the coins to the network, and it's primarily based on that a selection process happens. A block is forged. It's not necessarily created. This is terminology. Forging is terminology used specifically with proof of stake blockchains. And a block is forged. There's a transaction fee reward for doing this work, and then there's a verification process as well. But let's try and understand proof of stakes according to the three questions we came up with for consensus. So number one, what do you need to qualify? You need to stake coins. And in Ethereum 2.0, using that as an example, you need to stake about 32 ETH, which was worth approximately $66,000 as of June 30th of this year, 2021. Second, how does the network select who will write into the blockchain and who will verify what has been written, right? So your chances are proportionate to your stake size and other factors as well, designed to make the system of selection fair. Now, we're not going to get into the other factors, but just know that it can't only be stake size, because if it was just stake size, the person who had the most Ethereum coins, in this case, would always be the one selected, right? So the process does include other factors as well. So this pseudo-random process selects a validator who forges the block with transactions. And then this block typically has transactions which are ordered by the highest transaction fees first. The block forger broadcasts the transaction for the validators to verify. Now, different systems do this step in a slightly different way. Some use committees, like in Ethereum 2.0, but essentially a set of validators will verify the blocks, right? And third and lastly, what are the incentives and disincentives in place to keep that network in integrity? Well, for one, the chosen validators who forge the block, they get a part of the transaction fee of all the transactions in the block. So that's how they're compensated. Secondly, the validators who are verifying the information or verifying the blocks, they also get some part of the transaction fee, right? And finally, all validators, regardless of whether they're forgers or verifiers for each particular block, they get to earn interest on the coins they've staked. And the interest is variable, and this typically depends on how much of the coin has been staked in the network. So usually the more the number of coins staked in the network, the less you're going to get in terms of rewards, right? And validators, if they do create fake transactions and they are caught, there is something called a slashing penalty of your stake, which applies, which essentially means that a part of your stake is taken away based on the severity of your actions. So if you were trying to game the entire system, your entire stake could be taken away, right? And to break the integrity of the network, you need to have access to 51% of the staked coin. And if you manage to do that, well, then there's a good chance you can actually create fake and spurious transactions. Now let's look at proof of work versus proof of stake. And before I start here, just understand that comparing these two is like comparing apples and oranges. And there is actually no clear answer to whether one is better than the other. And the answer for most of the categories that we're going to discuss is going to be it depends, right? So with that in mind, let's get into it. So first, in terms of resources needed, proof of work requires specialized computer hardware. Proof of stake, we require a certain number of coins. There's no question of winner or loser here because it really depends on what the state of the network is. In Ethereum 2.0, 32 Ether costs about $66,000 as of June 30th to get you started. Whereas if you were to start on, let's say, Bitcoin, it would also be pretty expensive because you would need to buy pretty expensive and heavy computing power, and on top of that, that probably wouldn't make a dent anyway, given how many people are focused on being miners on Bitcoin. The only real way you can hope to make money as a miner on Bitcoin these days is if you join a mining pool. So again, it depends. If I picked another proof of work project like Litecoin or a smaller one, it would be less, right? So again, it depends. There's no clear winner here. Now, the only one area where I did find there was a clear winner was in terms of energy utilization. So there's just no question about this one. And the fact that proof of work requires this, the solution of these varying difficulty levels of cryptographic puzzles, it definitely leads to much higher energy consumption than any proof of stake project, right? And in proof of stake, there are no cryptographic puzzles. You are chosen in a pseudo-random manner, and your stake is one of those sort of variables that's looked at. Energy consumption is low. So here there is a clear winner, and that winner is proof of stake. Next, let's talk security. Now, in terms of security, proof of work is definitely vulnerable to the 51% attack, right? And if you had to do the attack today, it would probably cost you about $5.5 billion as of January 2021. So that's a lot of money. It's not very practical. But again, if you're looking at a proof of work system such as, let's say, Ethereum Classic or Bitcoin Gold, so over there, the network hashing power is significantly lower, so it's much easier to do the attack. And if you guys have been keeping up with the news, Ethereum Classic was attacked for millions of dollars, at least on 3 separate occasions not too long ago, right? And the same with Bitcoin. They were also attacked once or twice and had losses in the millions, right? But given sort of the strength of Bitcoin's hash rate, Bitcoin has not yet seen a 51% attack. And one more thing I'll say on this is this 51% attack is a bit of a misnomer. As long as you have a significant portion of the hashing rate, which is, let's say, even 33% of it, you essentially increase the probability. It's like a sliding scale. You'll increase the probability of being able to pull off a successful attack, the more hash power you contain or can get a hold of. Now, when you look at proof of stake, in proof of stake, essentially you need to control 51% of the coins that are staked, right? Now, here the deterrent primarily is the slashing penalty. So if you get caught out, you're trying to do something, trying to propagate some fake transactions and you get caught, your stake will essentially be slashed or taken away from you, right? And it could be the entire thing or it could be part of it, depending on what you were trying to do. But as is the case with proof of work, when you have a smaller number of stake coins, the attack is much easier to do. Next, in terms of decentralization, you could make an argument either way for either of these like consensus protocols, right? So proof of work can be suspect to centralization as mining pools can cluster powerful hardware, right? To increase the probability of being selected to create blocks, right? And therefore get, control of what information is being put inside the blockchain. Similarly, in proof of stake, you can have centralization as individuals or organization can use capital essentially to buy out stakes and increase their probability of being selected to forge blocks, right? So no clear winner here. It's just that depending on how it's set up, that's what's going to determine, which is more decentralized, proof of work or proof of stake. So it really depends on the specific implementation of it and a number of other factors like, how many folks are part of that network, how many are using, mining, a whole bunch of different things. But you cannot call out any direct winner here. And lastly, And I hear this a lot in terms of scalability. Oh, proof of work is more scalable than proof of stake. I think this is the wrong question. The question should really be, what are you trying to achieve in terms of scalability? If you look at absolute scalability, sure. Bitcoin, for example, supports only 5 to 7 transactions a second. Litecoin is slightly better at about 25 to 28 transactions a second. When you compare that with Ethereum, it can support 10 to 15 right off the bat. And Algorand, another proof of stake implementation, can support up to 1,000. But just know that in both these cases, there's so many variables, and the scalability can be extended using layer 2 solutions, right? So on Bitcoin side, Lightning Network would be an example of a layer 2 solution. And on proof of stake side, you have a number of these different shard chains coming up, which are layer 2 solutions, right? So you could think of the Matic network as a layer 2 solution for Ethereum. Ethereum's even building out its own layer 2 solution. But again, the point is, what are you trying to achieve? And then you can use layer 2 solutions to sort of beef up your transactions per second, whether it's proof of work or proof of stake. And if you can meet the threshold of what you're trying to achieve, it doesn't really matter, right? This kind of scalability question goes out of the window. So just want you guys to know, there can be no clear winner for proof of work versus proof of stake, because they're both consensus mechanisms, right? And even if you were to compare the specific implementation of these consensus mechanisms, like Bitcoin's proof of work with Ethereum 2.0's proof of stake, it would really depend on what the ecosystems look like at that point of time, which would determine which one is more scalable. And then the question to ask is, scalable for what? If I only need, let's say, a maximum of 15,000 transactions a second to do the most complex scaling kind of work, then, well, I think I can achieve that in both these using different layer 2 solutions. So hope you guys found that helpful. Hope that sheds some light for you on how you actually think about proof of work, proof of stake, how you think about consensus. And yeah, until the next one, guys, peace.